The blue sky over London was, by 1851, a lie the city had simply stopped bothering to tell. Not a metaphor, a measurable, documented physical reality recorded by chemists who were trying to understand why London children were presenting with lungs that looked like those of 50-year-old miners. The blue existed elsewhere, in oil paintings hung in wealthy drawing rooms, depicting an England that had either never existed or had ceased to exist decades prior. Above London, what remained was something else entirely. A low yellow-gray ceiling that smelled of sulfur and rendered fat and decades of accumulated combustion, that settled onto rooftops and clothing and skin and entered the throat like a damp cloth, pressed from the inside. That was the air. That was what there was. And the entire city breathed it. In 1851, London was the largest city on Earth. More than 2.5 million people compressed into an organism expanding without plan, without adequate sanitation, without any meaningful regulation of what could be burned or dumped or built next to a school or a river. The Great Exhibition had just opened in Hyde Park, that extraordinary glass cathedral, the Crystal Palace, gleaming in whatever light managed to penetrate the haze, celebrating British industrial genius before the eyes of the world. Queen Victoria herself attended on opening day, reported to be moved to tears by the spectacle. 6 million visitors would pass through its doors that year. The newspapers called it the triumph of civilization. Outside, 3 miles east, a 7-year-old named William was sweeping soot from a chimney flue for the 3rd time that morning. He would not read about the exhibition. He could not read. This is the story of the air between those two worlds. Coal was not a new problem in 1851. London had been burning it since the 13th century, when the city's forests were exhausted and sea coal from Newcastle began arriving by barge. By the Tudor period, the smoke was already bad enough that Queen Eleanor reportedly fled Nottingham Castle in 1257, driven out by the fumes from burning coal below. By the 1600s, the writer John Evelyn had presented a pamphlet to Charles II titled Fumi Fugium, an impassioned, almost desperate plea for the king to do something about London's air, describing a city wrapped in such clouds of smoke that residents could barely see across the street, that the buildings were blackened, that the very food tasted of coal, that foreigners arriving from the continent were convinced the city was on fire. Charles II apparently found the pamphlet interesting. Nothing changed. By 1851, the problem had not grown gradually. It had exploded. The Industrial Revolution had done something specific to London that is easy to state and difficult to fully absorb. It had multiplied the sources of combustion faster than any human nervous system could process as a crisis. Factories, gasworks, breweries, tanneries, brick kilns, iron foundries, glass manufactories, and beneath all of them, in every direction, the domestic hearths, hundreds of thousands of individual fireplaces in tens of thousands of homes, each one burning coal through the winter months, because coal was what you burned in London, because wood was expensive and scarce, because coal was what arrived on the barges from the north, because coal was what your neighbors burned, because there was no alternative and no one in authority was seriously proposing one. A single London winter day in the early 1850s released into the atmosphere what modern environmental historians estimate at somewhere between 200 and 300 tons of particulate matter, from chimneys, from hearths, from the simple act of a city trying to stay warm. To understand what this meant at street level, you need to understand what London smelled like in the morning. Not the entire morning. The specific hour just after dawn, when the domestic fires were being lit across the city simultaneously in Whitechapel and Southwark, and Bermondsey and Stepney, when the cold night air was still low and heavy and had nowhere to push the smoke except downward and inward. That hour smelled of sulfur dioxide, of tar, of partially combusted carbon, of the particular acrid sweetness of burning domestic coal mixed with the underlying permanence of the Thames at low tide, of horse dung on cobblestones, of the tanneries along the riverbank, processing animal hides in solutions of urine and oak bark. If you had never smelled it, you would not have had a word for it. If you had grown up in it, you had no idea it was unusual. It was simply the smell of the world. Your eyes watered. You thought it was the cold. The fog, what Londoners called simply the fog, what we now call smog, was not fog at all in the meteorological sense. It was a chemical reaction. The sulfur dioxide released by coal combustion, combined with the actual water vapor of genuine Thames fog to produce sulfuric acid mist, fine, suspended, slightly corrosive, capable of etching metal over time, capable of destroying lung tissue over a lifetime. On bad days, it turned yellow. On very bad days, it turned a color that Victorians described with the particular grimness of people who had stopped being surprised as pea soup, green-yellow, nearly opaque, capable of reducing visibility to a few feet. People walked into the Thames. Horses refused to move. On at least one occasion, an outdoor theatrical performance in Southwark was cancelled mid-act because the actors could not see each other on stage. These were not exceptional events reported with alarm. They were logged, noted, and continued. The people living inside this air were not uniformly affected, and this is the part that requires sitting with for a moment. The wealthy had options that were not options for anyone else. They could leave. When the autumn fogs descended and the coal smoke thickened toward winter, the families of means retreated to country estates, to the cleaner air of Surrey or Kent, returning to London only when social obligations demanded. Their houses, while still exposed to the outside air, were better constructed, thicker walls, better windows, the kind of architectural insulation that kept some of the outside outside. Their fireplaces burned better coal. Newcastle's best grades were expensive. The poor burned whatever came cheapest, which was often small coal, coal dust compressed into rough bricks, the residue of the sorting process, fuel that burned inefficiently, incompletely, releasing more particulate per unit of heat than the grades above it. The poor literally could not afford to pollute less efficiently. In Bermondsey, in Bethnal Green, in the rookeries of Street Giles, the physical architecture of poverty concentrated the problem further. These were not streets. They were courts, enclosed spaces barely wide enough for two people to pass, surrounded by 4- and 5-story buildings that blocked whatever wind might have dispersed the smoke. Washing was strung overhead, black within a day of being hung out. The walls of buildings in these areas, when examined by sanitary inspectors in the early 1850s, were consistently described as having a black, slightly greasy film of deposited coal tar and particulate that came off on your hand if you touched them. The interiors were worse. Rooms shared by multiple families, fires burning for cooking and heat in spaces with minimal ventilation, the smoke barely escaping, recirculating, filling the plaster and the furniture and the lungs of everyone sleeping there. A child born in Bethnal Green in 1851 had, statistically, less than a 50% chance of surviving to age 5. Respiratory illness was among the leading killers listed in the mortality records as bronchitis, as inflammation of the lungs, as consumption, as diseases of the chest, a category broad enough to contain the diverse consequences of breathing Bethnal Green air for 5 years. The doctors who worked in these areas, and there were some, though not nearly enough, described a particular kind of chronic cough that was simply the baseline condition of adulthood in the East End. Not a symptom of illness, the permanent state of a body that had adapted as much as it could and could not adapt further. The working day began before light, which in a London winter meant beginning in conditions of near complete darkness, compounded by smoke that reduced the already scarce light further. The match girls at the Bryant and May factory in Bow started at 6:30. The dockers along the Thames were already competing for work by 5. The market porters at Covent Garden had been moving crates since 3 in the morning. The chimney sweeps the climbing boys. Though by 1851 mechanical brushes existed, and the practice of sending children up chimneys had been nominally restricted by law, since 1840 operated in a world of concentrated exposure. The law was not enforced. Children continued to be sent up chimneys because they were smaller, cheaper, and more frightened than machines, and because the master sweeps who employed them answered to no one who was looking closely. A climbing boy spent his working hours inside the chimney flue, pressed against walls coated in creosote and soot, breathing the residue of everything that had been burned in that hearth, scraping the deposits loose with a small brush, or with his own elbows and knees, which were deliberately hardened in apprenticeship by being rubbed with brine and held close to a fire until the skin toughened into something like leather. They came out black, not metaphorically, completely, uniformly black, the soot packed into every pore, under every fingernail, in the corners of their eyes. Some masters allowed them to wash at the end of the day, some did not, reasoning that a boy who looked that way attracted more sympathy and therefore more customers on the street. Scrotal cancer, first clinically identified in chimney sweeps by surgeon Percival Pott in 1775, continued to appear in these boys at rates documented and then largely ignored by the medical establishment, who noted it as a curiosity of the profession rather than an indictment of a system. William, the boy we began with, was 8 years old by the time of the Great Exhibition's opening, not 7. He had miscounted his own age, or had never been entirely sure. He had a cough that started in October and didn't end until April, every year. Reliably, the way other children anticipated Christmas. He knew the insides of over 100 London chimneys. He could tell you which households burned good coal and which burned the cheap compacted dust. Because the residue was different, the cheap coal left a particular kind of sooty grease that was harder to shift and that stuck to your skin differently, almost like clay. He had never been to Hyde Park. The Great Exhibition itself, the Crystal Palace, the miracle of iron and glass that covered 18 acres of Hyde Park and contained more than 13,000 exhibitors from across the world, was, in its own way, a monument to the thing that was killing William's lungs. Not deliberately, but inevitably. The exhibition celebrated industrial production. It celebrated the machinery of manufacturing, the precision of British engineering, the capacity of coal-powered industry to transform raw material into finished goods at a speed and volume previously unimaginable. The Illustrated London News ran illustrations of visitors standing before steam engines the size of houses, expressions of wonder on their faces. These engines ran on coal. The factories they represented ran on coal. The city that hosted the exhibition ran on coal. The very glass of the Crystal Palace had been manufactured in furnaces running on coal. There was no coherent position available in 1851 from which to celebrate British industrial progress and simultaneously condemn the air quality it produced. The Victorians understood this in a vague way, the way we understand things that we prefer not to examine directly. Some reformers were already agitating the Smoke Nuisance Abatement Act had been passed in 1853, 2 years after the exhibition, trying to regulate industrial emissions, achieving almost nothing because enforcement was toothless and factory owners were better represented in Parliament than coughing children in Bethnal Green. The reformers wrote pamphlets. The smoke continued. What the exhibition did do, inadvertently, was expose the contradiction to itself. Visitors arriving from the countryside, from the continent, from America, people who had clean air, as a baseline experience walked through London to reach Hyde Park and recorded their impressions in letters and diaries with a consistency that reads almost like a collective document of shock. The streets were darker than expected. The buildings were blacker. The air had a taste. One American visitor noted, with a mixture of admiration and unease, that Londoners seemed entirely unaware that anything was wrong with the sky, that they went about their business beneath that yellow ceiling with the calm of people who have simply never seen anything different. He was right. For most Londoners, they hadn't. The question of what people breathed also intersected, in ways the Victorians were only beginning to understand, with what they ate and drank. Produce sold at outdoor markets absorbed particulate from the air. The vegetables arriving at Covent Garden each morning from market gardens in the surrounding counties were, by the time they reached a stall in Whitechapel, coated in whatever the air of their transit had deposited on them. Street food, the baked potatoes sold from carts, the eel pies, the hot coffee and tea dispensed by street vendors, was prepared in the open air, in the same air, by hands that had been in the same air all day. The food tasted of smoke in a way that was not a perception but a measurement. Contemporary accounts describe the taste of London food, especially in winter, especially in fog, as distinctly smoky, not in the pleasant sense of a cured ham, but in the flat, mineral, slightly acrid sense of coal combustion. The water, of course, was a separate catastrophe that intersected with this one. The Thames in 1851 was receiving the untreated sewage of the entire city, a crisis that would reach its logical endpoint 7 years later in the Great Stink of 1858. But the coal smoke had its own relationship with water. Acid rain, though not yet named as such, was observable. Rainwater collected in London had a measurably lower pH than rainwater collected outside the city. Stone buildings were visibly eroding faster than their counterparts in rural areas. The iron railings outside wealthy homes required more frequent painting. Fabric degraded faster. Everything in London lasted less long, wore out sooner, fell apart earlier than it should have. The city was conducting a slow acid bath on itself and everything within it, including its residents. And yet there was life inside this air. And it was not only suffering. The pub on the corner of a Bermondsey Street on a November evening in 1851 was warm in a way that nowhere else on that street was warm. The coal fire in the grate, the press of bodies, the smell of beer and pipe smoke, adding itself to everything else, it was its own kind of air, its own microclimate, and the people in it were laughing. There were songs. There was argument about the exhibition. Had anyone here been? No, but a man's cousin had, and had said the building alone was worth the price, which was 1 shilling, which was not nothing, but was manageable. There were complaints about the fog. There were complaints about the landlord. There was a woman near the window doing needlework because the light inside, such as it was better than anything she had at home. There was a child asleep across 2 chairs, breathing the pub air, which was terrible, but breathing it deeply, which meant they were warm. The street musicians played on winter afternoons with mufflers around their faces. The costermongers called their prices with voices already roughened by years of calling in that air. Voices that carried a particular gravelly quality that became, over time, something people associated with authenticity, with working Londonness, without ever quite connecting it to the specific physical damage that had produced it. People adapted. They did not adapt well. In any biological sense, they adapted in the way that humans adapt to impossible conditions, which is to say they normalized them, built cultures around them, found beauty and humor and community inside them, and died younger than they should have. The coal smoke of 1851 London did not end with the Victorian era. It continued, thickened, produced the Great Smog of December 1952, 5 days in which a weather inversion trapped pollution over the city at ground level, in which the air turned so dark that people could not see their own hands in front of their faces, in which between 4,000 and 12,000 people died directly, their lungs overwhelmed at last. That event produced the Clean Air Act of 1956. That act began the slow process of cleaning London's air that continues unevenly to this day. It took 100 years of documented suffering, of childhood lungs like miners' lungs, of pea soup fogs and acid rain and a body count hidden across 150 years of mortality registers listing bronchitis and chest inflammation to produce legislation with teeth. William, or the tens of thousands of children who were William, who swept those chimneys and breathed that air and coughed through every October to April, did not have a name in any of those registers. They had a category: diseases of the chest. The cause column was clean and clinical, and entirely uninterested in the specific texture of the soot that had produced it. Somewhere beneath the current streets of London, in the sediment layers of the Thames riverbed that geologists can core like a tree trunk and read like a calendar, there is a distinct black band. Dense, identifiable, chemically specific. It marks, with geological precision, the Victorian era, the Coal Age. You can point to it and say, here, this is where it got bad. This is the compressed record of everything that was burned. It has been there since before anyone thought to look for it, and it will be there long after the last person who remembers the smell is gone.